Okay, let me also take the opportunity to thank all the panelists. It's a very, very stimulating program. I talked to Giovanni, right? He wants a slight change in format. Instead of 25 minutes, we are going to do 22 minutes so that we can imitate the philosophers and have a panel at the end. So he wanted everybody to be seated here after the speakers have spoken. So we'll start right away. And I start with Leah Boustan from Princeton. Leah, come on, please.
So thank you to the organizers for the invitation to present here. It's really a fascinating and unique conference, and I've been learning a lot from the interdisciplinary interaction. I want to share some of my work with you today on the age of mass migration. I'm an economist, but also an economic historian, and I've been working on this period between 1850 and 1913, during which 35 million migrants from Europe entered the United States. And so the picture that you see here is a classic photograph from Ellis Island here in New York Harbor, and immigrants are waiting here to be processed for entry to the US. And they were granted entry with very limited restriction. There was no reference to family members or whether a job was waiting for them upon entry. And one of the major changes, which was alluded to already, were the 1920s system of national origin quotas. And I'll talk about that as we go. So I want to share some findings from work with my longtime collaborators, Ron Abramitsky and Catherine Erickson, about this period with some lessons for today. We have been putting together new panel data sets following individual immigrants using complete digitized historical censuses that allow us to follow people back to Europe and locate them in their home families in some cases, and also over time across census waves in the US. And what we found first are a series of studies on assimilation, is that concerns about the pace of assimilation for immigrants today are unfounded. You often hear, listening to conservative media and politicians, this comparison between past and present, sometimes implicit and sometimes quite explicit, that immigrants in the past joined the US economy and joined US society at a faster rate. They may have arrived earning very little, not knowing English, with very little wealth, and then very quickly moved up the occupational ladder and joined US society. But that in contrast, today, immigrants stay in enclaves, they don't speak English, and they do not move quickly into US economy and society. We find results that are quite contrary to this. The pace of assimilation is very similar in the past and present, both in terms of economic assimilation, moving up the occupational ladder, and cultural assimilation. The big difference between past and present is the size of initial gaps between immigrants and natives in economic terms. So in the past, we were drawing migrants from peer economies. Half of our migrants were coming from Western Europe, from countries that had GDP per capita equivalent of the US. The other half were coming from countries on the European periphery that were poorer. But the ratio of GDP per capita between the US and the sending countries was around 2-to-1. Today, our most typical sending partner of Mexico, when that migration really took off in the early 70s, the ratio was more like 7 or 8-to-1 in terms of GDP per capita, US relative to Mexico. So the gaps are larger and it takes longer for those gaps to close, not because the pace of assimilation is slow, but because just the initial gaps are larger. The second thing I want to touch on is some work that relates to the renewed calls for immigrant restrictions. There have been calls in the recent administration to reduce slots for legal entry up to 40 or 50%. The last time we've seen policy changes of this size were the national origin quotas of the 20s. So we're going to look at the effect of the quotas on local economies. And what we find is a set of results that are quite different across locations. In established cities, we see that when quotas were enacted and fewer immigrants arrive in those locations from Southern and Eastern Europe, that labor was almost entirely replaced, almost one for one from new inflows. And in unskilled sector, those flows were coming from the rural South, with Black workers joining the Great Black Migration, and also, interestingly, flows from Mexico. For the first time, Mexican migrants were unrestricted by the quotas, and they were arriving in US cities. In rural areas, though, we see something quite different, where when immigrants stop flowing in, native internal migrants also stop flowing to those areas. Population growth slows and economic growth slows. I probably won't have time to go into great detail on each piece, but let me start by saying something about immigrant assimilation. So economists, when they talk about assimilation, tend to talk only about economic gaps. Immigrants earn less than natives when they first arrive. Do they close those gaps with time spent in the US? So I will show you one or two slides on that definition, and then I will show you some results as well on cultural assimilation, something that economists tend not to think about. Okay, so this slide here shows some evidence on immigrant assimilation from 1900 to 20 with what we thought we knew and what we know now from new data. So what we thought we knew. This comes from the dotted line here with one snapshot of data, or a cross-section. So if we had data only for the year 1900 from the 1900 census, and we were interested in looking at economic assimilation, what economists would do is they would take migrants who had arrived recently in 1899 and compare them to migrants who arrived a long time ago in 1870. And say, oh, that must be the path at which migrants move up the ladder with time spent in the US. So this picture, 0 represents earnings of natives, and then the dots represent earnings of immigrants who've arrived in the US at different points. Just less than 5 years ago, 6 to 10 years, and so on. You see that initial immigrants upon first arrival earn less than natives. That's a gap of around 15%. And then they close the gap completely after 30 years. That's what we thought we knew. And when we had data from only one census, we had to make this assumption that recent arrivals from 1899 would look like long-term arrivals who came in 1865 or 70 after spending 30 years in the country. What we did instead was just follow people. So you follow people across census waves. It's easy, but it's not so easy if you don't have the computers that will allow you to follow people across censuses. We follow people by first name, last name, age, and country or state of birth. Follow some natives, follow some immigrants, and what we see instead is on average a pattern that looks like this. Immigrants on average at that time earned no different from natives upon first arrival and no different from natives after 30 years. But this average is a weighted average of some of our peer economies where the migrants are doing a lot better than natives, and then some of the peripheral economies where migrants are doing a lot worse. So now just take account of these two dots here, 0 to 5 years in the country versus 30 years in the country, and let's look at what that pattern looks like across a variety of sending countries. So here we see why, on average, immigrants earn the same as natives. It's because there's a set of immigrants from England, Wales, Scotland, France, Ireland, as well as from Russia, that are earning more than natives, and then a set of immigrants that are earning less. When we think about convergence, moving up the economic ladder, what we're thinking about are people who start out earning less. So let's focus on those immigrants. A lot of the gap is closed after 30 years in the US, but not all of it. There's no country at that time that closed all of the initial gap in one generation. So what we thought we knew was coming from a comparison of apples to oranges of immigrants who arrived in 1899, probably from Italy and Poland, immigrants who arrived in 1865 or 70, coming from Ireland or Germany. They're very different, and we should not compare them. We should compare a person to himself or herself after some time in the country. So the pace of assimilation in the past is a lot slower than we thought. It looks much more like what the pace of assimilation looks like today. And So we have no need for concern if we see slow assimilation. It takes more than a generation. That was also true in the past. Now, let me mention cultural assimilation. I think this is what many of the commentators on the street would think, when they talk about assimilation. It's not so much about economic gaps, it's about, do immigrants join our society? How do we measure that? It's hard to find data in a systematic way on food or dress or celebrating holidays. So what we look at are the names that immigrant parents give to their children after spending time in the US. We do this for the past using census data, where all of the names are revealed. But we also do this for the present using California birth certificate data. And we construct a foreignness index for each name. It's time, place specific. So there's nothing inherent about the name Kurt that is inherently a foreign or a native sounding name. Kurt was actually one of the most foreign names in the past, and it's a very native sounding name today. So foreign names, for example, include Hyman and Vito in the past, and native names were names like Clay and Lowell. It just comes from the relative probability of the name being given by a foreign parent or a native parent. And what we see is that with time spent in the US, this is for the historical data, immigrants choose names that are less and less foreign over time. What does this index value mean? It ranges from 0 to 100, and the gap between immigrants and natives is around 30 points on this index. 25 or 30 points, something like that. So after 20 years spent in the US, immigrants erase a third to a half of the gap in naming between foreigners and natives in the past. What does that look like in the present? So this is exactly where the interest comes in this research, because we can compare past and present directly. And so this is exactly what people are thinking when they think immigrants don't join society today. Well, it turns out that they do at almost exactly the same pace. So the black line here is from the California data for immigrants today, using an index of the same scale, erasing around 10 points from a gap of around 30 after spending time in the US. The one challenge with the modern data is that on a birth certificate, you don't report your year of entry in the US. So what we do instead is look at the mother's age at birth, and we compare children within a mother. Okay, so we only compare children that a mother has 2 or 3 kids in the state of California. That's what we're looking at. And if you look at this identity down here, a mother's time in the US at the time of birth is equal to her age at the time of birth, which is something we observe, minus her age at arrival in the US. So if she arrived at 20 and she had a kid at 23, she's been in the US for 3 years. And within a mother, age at arrival is a fixed characteristic. So if we're comparing within a mother, then age at birth and time in the US at birth both increment up 1-to-1 with each other. If we look at age at birth in the historical data, we find exactly the same pattern, because these two variables are mechanically identical or completely correlated once we're looking within a mother. The pace of change that we see past and present with time spent in the US on this one cultural metric, which is the one that we can shine light on under the lamppost, we see that the concerns about speed of cultural assimilation are unfounded. Why are people so concerned then about assimilation today? My guess is that it has to do with this. So this is the difference between the earnings of the average immigrant and the average native over time. We have missing information in the middle of the century because the census ceased to ask questions about year of arrival. So we're not able to look at recent immigrants in the middle part of the century. Immigration had shut off, so they just stopped asking those questions. And so we're looking here at immigrants who arrived within the past 5 years compared to natives. Hardly any gaps during the period of age of mass migration. Remember, this is on average. We saw that there were some groups doing really well, some groups doing poorly. This is the last year before the border reopens. Most of these immigrants are coming from East Germany, Hungary. These are Cold War migrants. Again, no gap between those migrants and natives. Border opens, we suddenly start to take in immigrants from many countries around the world, developing countries that are much poorer than the US, and the gap suddenly is now more like 30% of earnings. Not something inherent about the person, something about the country from which they are coming, the set of economic and educational opportunities that they had growing up in those countries, and therefore the skill level of immigrants coming in is much different from the typical native today. But the pace of change from this initial gap is the same as in the past. So it will take longer, but assimilation is happening to the same degree. So I want to turn to thinking about the effect of the 1920s border closure. I know I have 22 minutes, so I don't know how many minutes left, but 5 or 6 maybe? 7, great, okay. So in looking at the border closure, what we're looking at is the period of the 1920s, illustrated in this figure here. This is the share of the US population that's foreign-born for the past 150 years, coming from the census. 15% of the population foreign-born during the age of mass migration. Then we have the border closure and the system of quotas that cuts immigration from 1 million a year down to 150,000. And as a result, the share foreign-born falls to its nadir of 5% in 1970. So we're going to be thinking about the period of the 1920s. How did the border closure happen? This political cartoon sums it up well. We have all the migrants interested in coming to the US from Europe, and then Uncle Sam standing at the fine point of the funnel, holding up a card that says 3%. 3% of what? Initially, 3% of the stock of migrants living in the US as of 1910, country by country. So who were those migrants in 1910? Well, if we look at the composition of where migrants came from in 1910, around 50% came from Northern and Western Europe. So that would be Britain, Ireland, Germany, Scandinavia. Those are the countries who received 50% of the quota slots. 1924, this policy is revised, so instead of using 1910 as the basis, it was 1890. That is not an innocuous change at all. We see that over 80% of the stock in the country in 1890 was from Northern and Western Europe, so that's who got the slots. And the basis was changed from 3% down to 2%. So across country, the extent to which the quota is binding varies a lot. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use 2 things. One, this national policy change, where immigration is tightened, but also variation across local labor markets in the share of the population that comes from a set of quota-affected countries. So let me illustrate that variation in 2 dimensions. One is just over time. If we look at the countries represented over here on the left from Southern and Eastern Europe, those are the countries most affected by the quota policy. And we see the blue bars here are the migration from those countries in a period of unimpeded migration. Over 1.5 to 2 million entrants over the decade of the 1900s. The green lines illustrate the quota slots allocated to those countries, cut by an order of magnitude. And the red lines illustrate actual inflows over the 1920s decade, a little higher than the quota slots simply because 1920 and 21 were unrestricted. If you look year by year, the quota restrictions are completely binding. When we look at Northern and Western Europe, there are some countries that are affected by the quotas as well, especially Scandinavia. And then when we look at the Americas are unaffected by the policy and in fact seem to have some responsive in-migration, which we will see in the results. Now the second piece of the variation is across local labor market. So here we have a set of state economic areas. They're clusters of counties intended to represent a commuting zone. And the heat map shows you the share of the population that was affected by the quota in some initial period, as of the year 1900. What you see in the map is that essentially there's a north-south divide that pops out most strongly. There were very few migrants in the south. But even within the north, there's quite a lot of differentiation in the share of the population that's affected by the quota. So what is this measure exactly? We look in 1900 at two things. We have the share of the population coming from each foreign sending country, and then we have a measure of the extent to which the quota was binding. Take a look. These are the unimpeded flows, and these are the quota slots. So if the quota slots were equal to the unimpeded flows, as in the case of Germany, then this measure is going to be 0 for Germany. If the quota slots are much lower than the unimpeded flows, then this ratio is going to be close to 1. So for a country like Italy, the quota policy was almost entirely binding, and for a country like Germany, it hardly was binding at all. So we're going to weight the population in 1900 from foreign sending countries by the extent to which the policy restricted inflow. And what we find is that this policy was very effective in restricting inflow. We see that places that had more of the population affected by the quota then received fewer immigrants after the border closes. So we're able to use this variation to think about how does an economy respond when immigration is cut off. So I will show you that in 2 slides, and then we will end. Okay. So first we want to just see that indeed the policy did cut off immigration to the places that were more affected by the quotas. So the top line here are just a series of decades in the unimpeded period, and the bottom row here are some decades after the policy is enacted. I include 1910 to 20 here because this was the decade of World War I. So though the policy was not in place yet, immigration was cut off for 4 years out of that decade through the events of the war. So in the period before the policy is enacted, the further a location is to the right, meaning the more affected it would be by the quota, the more immigrants are coming in. That's true in the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s. Once the policy is affected, the further you are to the right, meaning the more your population is affected by the quota, the fewer immigrants are coming in. So what we're interested in is the difference between before and after the policy is enacted. Before, these locations should be receiving immigrants. Afterwards, they will be losing immigrants. And this is exactly what we see. European immigrants are declining after the policy in locations that are more affected by the quotas. But what we're most interested in then is how does native population respond? How does the local economy adapt? And the answer is quite different between cities and rural areas. In cities, we actually see all of the lines here are above 0, meaning that there's inflows. When migrants are cut out from that local economy, other forms of substitute labor flow in. We have Mexican and Black entrants flowing in to unskilled jobs. And then we have native whites flowing from rural to urban areas to take skilled positions. When we break things down by sector, we see that indeed it's in unskilled jobs in which Mexicans and Blacks are filling in, and it's in skilled jobs in which rural whites are filling in. In rural areas, though, the answer is quite different. As immigrants are being lost, so too are native internal migrants. So those areas on the periphery were losing population and losing forms of economic activity after the quota. Okay, so I will conclude with the lessons for today. We saw that now the developing world is able to participate to some degree in international migration. So immigrants to the US start out with larger economic gaps relative to the native born than during the age of mass migration. But yet, these immigrants are converging to the native born at the same pace as in the past. Convergence takes time, and there is no cause for alarm. The final study that I went through relatively quickly, we see that immigration restriction may not help the intended targets. So the policy architects of the quotas were not intending to provide job opportunities for native Black workers flowing from the South or from new Mexican entrants. Those are the groups that were helped by the policy to a large extent. Who was hurt? It was mostly rural America, where there were locations that had been transitioning from agriculture to industry and had been attracting population that were harmed the most.
Thank you, and thanks for the chance to present here. I'm also going to talk a little bit about immigration history in the U.S. I've learned a lot today. I hope I can offer something new. I want to talk about who wins from restricting immigration. So U.S. policy, as you may have noticed, has been moving in a restrictive direction lately. And, you know, it's worth pointing out, I think, that this predates the Trump administration. So for the past 20 years, when we've been unable to pass immigration reform that would give legal status to the large unauthorized population living in the U.S., we've had a restrictive H-1B visa quota for the past 15 years or so. And, you know, the whole idea of numerically arbitrary numerical caps on categories of immigrants is, you know, a century old. And so it must be the case that there's a constituency for this, that there are people who think this is a good idea. So I wanted to talk about some lessons from past restrictions on immigration and take a look at who won from those restrictions. You know, what do I have, 20 minutes is not enough to talk about every twist and turn of U.S. immigration policy over the past century. So I'll focus on three that I know something in particular about. The first is a kind of an early major attempt to restrict who could come to the U.S., which was a literacy test passed by Congress in 1896. And it would have become the law, and I'll show you it would have had a dramatic impact on who came to the U.S., but it was vetoed by the president. But it was only a temporary reprieve. The literacy test was passed in 1917, and there was quotas in the 1920s that we just heard about. And really the whole basis, you know, of our modern system is this era's policies. They kind of, you know, even though we don't restrict on targeted national origins anymore, the idea of quotas is the system we have nowadays that wasn't in the past. Second, I want to talk about when we suddenly ended a very large guest worker program for Mexican agricultural labor in the 1960s and the impact of that. And lastly, I want to talk about a case where we went the other way in the mid-1980s and we gave legal status to the unauthorized population that existed in the country at the time and what the impact of that was. All right, as I said, you know, restriction has been a large part of U.S. immigration policy, and so that must mean that there's some view that this is helpful. So what is this view? Well, it comes from a lot of different places, I think, and I don't have the time to talk about all of them, but so let me focus initially, at least, on the kind of the labor market views that generate this. So I think a lot of the kind of motivation for such policies comes out of views that I would call simplistic about how the labor market operates. So a very common one is this idea that every immigrant who has a job means out there somewhere is a native who lost their job or was unable to get a job, right? There's sort of a fixed pool of jobs available, and so anybody who gets one. And in modern times, this seems to be framed in this, I think, even almost more extreme way, which is anytime you see someone without a job, we got to hold off on immigration until that's resolved. So here's a quote from Jeff Sessions. It is not mainstream but extreme to continue surging immigration beyond any historical precedent, and to do so at a time when almost 1 in 4 Americans aged 25 to 54 does not have a job. So we'll leave aside the abuse of the non-employment rate in that quote, but the other thing that's worth pointing out is, and also as well as the kind of historical precedent, we just saw the historical precedent, I'll show you that again in a minute. You see the kind of nature of this argument, right? There's unemployment, so we can't allow immigration. That's the extent of the argument. Now, there's a level up from that. There's a slightly more sophisticated view that almost sounds like economics, which is we know that adding more workers lowers wages on average, right? That the demand curve sloped down, more workers means lower wages. And I could have brought a quote from Jeff Sessions on this one too. And it's not that I'm picking on Jeff Sessions. That, these views are pretty common, right? Jeff Sessions has some good quotes. Like what he said it defies economic reason. He didn't use the word economic. He said it defies reason to argue anything other than adding workers through immigration lowers wages. And then he goes on to make this analogy. Well, what happens when the supply of wheat goes up, the kind of price of wheat goes down, right? So this, and again, not just Jeff Sessions, he just happens to be in power now, so he's not in the audience, right? So and let me just say, if this was your belief, right, this conclusion would be correct, right? That if you thought, or it's potentially correct, it's at least a valid rationale, like that if you thought that immigration lowers wages on average and takes jobs from the local population, this would be the policy. You'd want to restrict immigration. Okay, so I described it as simplistic, so that means I must think there's a flaw in this reasoning. I think there's a lot of flaws, but let me focus on like two key things that I think are missing from that logic. So the two things I think are missing from that are that immigrant native skill differences matter, and we've heard about that earlier today from more than one speaker. And then the other one that we've heard less about is that other employer inputs are not static. So just briefly to say a little bit more, so I think intuitively, and I think even Jeff Sessions gets this, the idea that immigrants compete with other workers who have similar skills and don't compete with workers who have different skills, I think is intuitively obvious. What's maybe less obvious to non-economists maybe is that and the other employer inputs factor into this as well, is that bringing in workers with different skills actually enhances the demand for workers, with other skills. So that is not as obvious and not as talked about as much. So the analogy I could give is when you hire an assistant to help you out, right? They definitely displace some of the work that you would have done. But we don't usually think of that as a bad thing, right? That frees us up to work on other things that make us more productive overall, right? And if you take that logic to the level of the economy, that's what we have in mind, this kind of specialization and the gains from it. Now, at an economy-wide level, like bringing in, say, low-skill workers, on average, natives are high-skill, so on average, natives might be better off because of immigration. Now, I don't want to totally gloss over the distributional consequences of that policy, so that low-skilled workers might be worse off. They don't have to be, by the way, though. It may be that immigration kind of lifts all boats on average and lifts low-skilled boats less. That's a possibility. We know less about the overall scale effects of immigration than we do about the distributional impacts. But I will talk about this just now. So the other inputs are not static, right? So at a basic level, the number of jobs is not fixed. In response to inflows of workers, new employers pop up, new job opportunities. Let's not forget that immigrants are consumers as well. Many of the new businesses are started by immigrants themselves. Mangus Lostron had an estimate, at least for a little while, I don't think it's still true, that the net number of new businesses created in the US was entirely due to immigration for a while, and without them, there would have been no net increase in number of new businesses. In any case, so new businesses are added, economy scales up. There's one more subtle point that I'll get, and I'll stop being abstract for a while. So these two forces might interact with each other. So the other thing that might happen, and this addresses some of the distributional concerns, is that the way firms use labor, the way they use a kind of mix of skilled and unskilled workers may not be kind of a predetermined characteristic of the economy. And even economists often model this in a fairly rigid way. In fact, the way employers use labor may adapt to the kind of availability of labor. So in response to an inflow of low-skilled labor, they might find ways of producing that uses more low-skilled labor than they had in the past. All right, so that's very abstract. Why don't I go to some specific examples so we can see this in action. So let me start with the 1897 literacy test that wasn't. So responding to the wave of heavily illiterate Southern and Eastern European migrants that we just saw some facts on, in 1896, Congress passed a literacy requirement for immigration that was then vetoed. So it didn't happen. And so what happened after that? So this figure, I've got two lines, and what this is they are immigrants as a share of the native population by literacy. So the solid line is the illiterates, and the dashed line is the literate population. And so the way economists would see this is like the gap between those lines is the shock to the supply of low-skilled labor compared to high-skilled labor. And so in the mid-19th century, immigrants were more skilled than the native population, at least measured by literacy. And that began to change with this kind of new origin new countries of origin in the late 19th century. And you can see that in 1890, they were on average the same literacy as the native population. And that's when Congress noticed this was happening and decided to pass a literacy test, which is shown by that blue line there. But they failed, right? That was vetoed, and you can see the consequences of that, right? There was an enormous increase in the supply of low-skilled labor as a result of that not passing that literacy test. Now you think, so this is a big supply shock. This is going to lower the wages of illiterate workers or low-skilled workers. Maybe, and so we might be concerned about that, and I will talk about that. It's worth remembering again, though, most natives were literate. Over 90% of natives at this time were literate, and so you'd expect at least the average native-born worker to be better off as a result. So let's stop talking about what might happen and look at what did happen. So there's a nice paper by Marco Tabellini looking at what happened, and so how do we look at this? So what we do is we do what Leah just talked about, where there's a kind of a differential impact on areas because the immigration flows were concentrated geographically. So you can compare places that got a lot of these immigrants to places that didn't. And he finds that as you would expect based on what I just told you, on average the areas that experienced this wave of migration, you saw natives moving up the occupational ladder compared to places that did not. By the way, those same areas, some work by Nancy Chan and co-authors, those same areas are better off today. So there's kind of long-run benefits of this wave of immigration. All right, so I didn't want to leave out the distributional consequences of this. What about the low-skilled natives? Well, this is where my kind of other point comes in about the kind of the theory of the immigration, which is employers might have been able to adapt to this. And in particular, in this era, manufacturing firms, and that's what we looked at, were rolling out new kinds of machinery that was replacing manual labor. So what we did is we looked at their use of this kind of machinery. And what we find is that essentially employers adapted by adopting these machines more slowly. And so in other words, instead of displacing native workers, what they displaced was machinery. That accounts for about 80% of the adjustment to this. And so as a result of that ability to adapt, right, the kind of labor market impact must have been much smaller than you would predict based on a fixed production technology. Indeed, we do some simulations and argue that had the 1897 literacy test been signed, low-skilled wages wouldn't have grown that much faster, at least relative to this shock, the size of the shock. So they would have been maybe a little bit worse off. Again, we don't know about the absolutes, just in relative terms. Okay. Let me turn to another example, which is the end of the Bracero program. So the Bracero program, if you hadn't heard of it, is a large guest worker program that ran from the 40s until the 60s. Peaking around 500,000. Just for some context, that's about 5 times larger than a comparable agriculture guest worker program today. And in certain areas, and this is more to the point really, in certain areas there's a very large share of the agricultural workforce, the temporary agricultural workforce. And then it was abruptly terminated in 1964 based on the very precisely those simplistic arguments I gave you at the beginning of the talk. The idea that, of course, this is going to create jobs for native farm workers and raise their wages. It's going to improve conditions on U.S. farms. There were other arguments as well, but this was a pretty core piece of the argument at the time. So here you can see a map of the very concentrated shares of the agricultural workforce were these bracero workers. All right. So what happened? So, what happened is that Michael Clemens and Hannah Postel found some very nice historical data that allowed them to look at this, and they invited me to join them in this paper. And what happened is not only did native wages not go up, if anything, they fell. And there was not a massive creation of farm jobs for a native-born worker. On top of that, there's a graduate student here, actually, who has shown that the kind of land values of U.S. farms fell differentially in these kind of highly impacted areas. And that's very, that's what you'd expect, right? Like, you lose a complementary input, your asset value is going to go down. But what about this labor market finding? Are we kind of repealing the law of supply and demand as one kind of person who kind of advocated for the end of the Bracero program said, or much like we'd be repealing the law of gravity? We don't actually think so. So we go through, three arguments in the paper for why that might be a completely reasonable outcome. So one is the specialization, right? Braceros may have done certain kinds of farm tasks, natives may have done others, and if you lose a complementary input, you're going to be less productive. You had to spend more time, natives had to do more time doing field preparation and things they weren't very good at. As a result, they were less productive. Output of certain crops was cut. We show that directly for crops that it wasn't easy to adjust. And on top of that, farms switched to mechanized harvest. This same grad student has shown that they started inventing new machines on top of that. So here's what tomato harvesting looked like in California prior to the end of the Bracero program, largely by hand. Within a few years after the end of the program, it looked more like this. They rolled out these kind of mechanical harvesters that were fairly newly invented. Within a few years, all of the processed tomatoes in California were harvested this way. There's a similar thing with cotton, less dramatic, because the cotton harvester was much more adopted beforehand, but similar thing happened with that as well. All right, so I don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to talk about what happened when we relaxed restrictions. So in particular, the Immigration and Reform and Control Act of 1986. This law is the model of many of the kind of immigration reform proposals that have come up over the past 20 years, none of which have passed, but this is basically the model for how to do it. At this time, it gave legal status, or allowed unauthorized population to apply for legal status, and about 2.7 million of them eventually did. So how can we learn about what happened? Unfortunately, we don't have a huge amount of data on what happened to them. So I'll tell you what happened to them that we know. But what we do know is we know where they were when this happened, and they are a large share of the population, so we can look at the areas that were differentially impacted. So here, just within California, which is where most of them were, by the way, even within California, there's a tremendous amount of variation in the density of these guys, and it's high, too. Something like 12% of LA's population was unauthorized and then became authorized by the end of the 90s. So we might expect to see something by comparing across areas. So what happened? So the wage of legalized workers went up. So that's from the individual level data. And from the aggregate data, we can see that crime rates went down. We can say the number of tax returns filed went up, and we can look at the magnitude of that. That's consistent with basically none of them filing taxes beforehand and all of them filing taxes, or filing at a rate that's pretty typical for a kind of population. And then on top of that, we can see access to the earned income tax credit went up quite a bit, and basically again with consistent with full access and no access beforehand. And then we're just finding some evidence now that women who were likely unauthorized were now suddenly getting access to prenatal care that they weren't beforehand. So let me just say one thing about this, right? So this touches on one of the other arguments you hear for why we should restrict immigration, which is it costs money to let people in. There's kind of government programs and other things. But it's worth pointing out that something like the EITC or prenatal care, right, while it costs money, it also has benefits, right? And in particular with the EITC, we know those benefits are worth the money that's put in from research. And so there's a sense in which it's kind of like, okay, we don't want to pay for it now, we're just going to end up paying for it later, right? The unauthorized immigrants are here, we're denying them kind of income support programs, we're just going to end up, perpetuating child poverty for another generation by doing that. So that brings me to my last thing, which you just kind of, I don't know if I'm going to be able to recommend a policy or anything like that, but there are, I think, lessons from history about like a better direction for U.S. immigration, a more sensible direction. One of the things that's, I think, a very strong theme is that the harm from legal immigration is tremendously exaggerated, right? Like all the rationales that have been given for these very restrictive policies are not justified by the evidence. We've been able to absorb tens of millions of immigrants in the past and done so successfully. And employers have been able to adapt to defray the distributional consequences. I mean, I actually think I shouldn't maybe push that too hard because I think that we could do more research on how like the service sector and other sectors that I haven't looked at adapted. But so far I see a lot of evidence that there's a lot of adaptability. In contrast, the harm from restricting immigration is clear. The average native worker, let's be clear about this, the average native worker is worse off economically because of immigration, right? Not by restricting immigration, I'm sorry, not better off. It seems like tax receipts are lowered by limiting the legal status of the population that's here. And there are potential long-run consequences of doing that as well. I mean, most children of unauthorized immigrants are U.S. citizens that are going to be here in 30 years. So my view, and I guess I may end up having to be specific, but is that we ought to at least be thinking about ways to make our system less restrictive. If we do that in an intelligent way, maybe we can learn something about the consequences of different particular policies. And I do think there actually is quite a bit of a constituency for a less restrictive policy. I think nobody is happy with a system that's so bureaucratic, so complicated, and difficult to use. So I think there's a lot we can do that looks better than the policy we have. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I will also close this panel by I'm going to be very pragmatic. I'm going to bring you back to the present and give you a few numbers and a few things that I think are simple and I think help us thinking about the current policy. So if anything, push even further the connection between this conference and where we are today in the United States and why many of the things which have been said I think are very reasonable. So again, I will say, so Michael started saying we worry too much about immigrants and wages and labor, and then Ethan has talked a lot about that. I'm going to say just one thing about this. I'm going to bring it one step further. I don't think that immigration is even had a particularly interesting and important role in increasing inequality, wage inequality in the United States. And there are two very simple facts, I think, that fly in the face of this explanation, and I'm going to show them to you. Also, I want to reframe things. Sometimes we say skilled immigration is very useful. Skilled immigration, so the US immigration in the last 15 years in particular has been incredibly skill intensive, excessively skill intensive, in fact. And I'm going to show that in a sense, what we have to wonder about is can we maintain the situation in which no unskilled is coming in and very few people who do the jobs at the low level are produced by our own economy. And then I'm going to argue that it's very important to think about policies, specific policies, and here very quickly, I will not even go on the H-1B, which has been taught. I'm going to talk about two policies in two other countries, which I think teach us something interesting. And finally, I will end talking about immigration and politics, immigration and vote of the native, because this is a part we didn't touch, but I think is interesting. So, one reason why it's hard to assess the impact of immigration on wages and on labor market is that immigrants are very responsive to labor market themselves. So immigrants are not this change in supply that happens in a place. Immigrants choose where to go. And in many cases, I would say that most of the model that we have will predict that they don't have a very large impact on wages, and I will show you the gist of why I think in aggregate this has to be true. But if we look at association evidence, even without going into causality, and I will talk, so looking at how wages of low-skilled look at the local level, I think that we see that the effect cannot be big, because the correlation that we find go the opposite way than what we would have if immigrants were really depressing wages, and depressing wage of low-skilled in particular. So let me say one thing. We start from an issue which is very real, which is the wage of American workers have been, of the median American worker, has been stagnating and growing very slowly. And the wages of low-skilled worker have been actually declining in real terms for 30 plus years, for a very long period. And the income and the wage inequality has increased substantially in the United States. That's a real thing. That's the thing that all economists say. Here I have one representation of this fact, and this is the percentage change in wages over 34 years, starting in 1980, categorizing worker according to their education, with no high school, some college, bachelor, more than bachelor. And you see that the wage problem that Americans have is that not that wages have not grown. They have grown in real terms more than 20% for college degree, but they have not grown a lot at the low end. In fact, in real terms, they have even declined. So if you want immigration to be able to explain nationally part of this, and you want a simple story as Ethan has brought of demand and supply, you need to see a bunch of immigrants coming in this low category and very few immigrants coming here, because the relative supply must change the opposite way. And the answer of this, why this not explain that, is that there was simply too much high-skilled immigration in the United States. This is the same distribution of the change in supply of each group in percentage due to immigration over the same period. Yes, there are a little bit more immigrants here than here, but there are many more if you take those 34 years. There were many more immigrants as a share of college they came in the United States than there were down here. And so there must have been something else that has generated this inequality. I want to show you how this has become a way more dramatic in the last 15 years. So if we're worried about what is happening right now, the same chart in the last 15 years, looking at the growth in immigrants as a percentage of the group from 2000, shows that immigration, here you have broken down the high degree in bachelor, master, and doctorate. Immigrants are coming and increasing a lot the supply at the very high end. So since the 2000s, so there has been a period of relatively large inflow of low-skilled immigrants that generated this big chunk, but that was the 90s. The 90s was a period of quite large inflow, not so much the 80s, and not so much the 2000s. And so if we want to see what immigration is doing to the US economy today and has done in the last a decade and a half, this is more what looks like. So this naturally brings us to think that immigration has been quite skilled, and we need to talk about skilled immigrants if we want to understand what they have done. Of course, there is no lack of explanation for why the wage of the low-skilled here that I showed you is done so badly, and many of these explanations economists think are responsible for a lot. The fact that production has changed a lot of this job has been substituted by computer, international trade and offshoring have substituted some of this job, manufacturing has been declining significantly, and so have unionization and real minimum wage. Those are all potential stories, and none of them really is driven by immigration. Now, I want to focus on a slightly different thing here, which is, before I go doing that, what is the other piece of evidence that I think we have a hard time overcoming if we really think that immigration is a cause of depressed local wages and depressed wage of low skill, is the correlation that we get in local economies. So I would say that very simply, I've done just as Leah has shown for the modern time, I've broken down the United States into local labor markets, and the darker labor market are the one that in the last 30, 40 years they have received a way more immigrant. Some of these local labor markets currently have a percentage of their labor force which is 30%, 40% immigrant. Some of these have 1%, 2%. And just in a very correlational way, which is no causation at all, if you plot and chart how wages for natives have grown in those local labor markets and how the change and how the share of immigrant has changed, you get this very strong positive association. So market where a lot of immigrant came in the inflow of immigrant is measured here, are also market where on average native have been earning more, but also where on average low-skilled native have been earning more. So if you correct for, and the explanation of this is that both native and immigrant go in good cities, in good economies in large part, and they move away from economies which are not very good. But even when you try to correct for all of these and do the best you can in order to separate that, this correlation maybe go from positive to zero, so immigrant, once you control for all the rest, have not affected much the wage of natives, but it's hard that you get the reverse, that they actually had a negative impact on that wage. So these two facts already tells you that there is not very much prima facie evidence, and I'm gonna leave it around. We tried to also assess some cases which we thought were more experiment-like. There has been a big contention here. This is a case in which we look at one experiment in which in Miami a big flow of Cuban happened in a place, and we compare Miami wages to the wages of similar cities. And what I can tell you here is that there is no evidence, although there is a lot of noise in the data and a lot of other people have looked at this data and found all over, there doesn't seem to be no clear evidence that the wage of Miami, that is this thing relative to the wage of the other, dropped down, or the unemployment in Miami relative to this thing dropped up. So even in the short run impact that we can study of immigration, we don't find very much of this. But I think that the interesting thing that this also says that immigrants seem to be different type of worker than native in this other respect. They seem to respond much more to economic incentive. They seem to go, two things they seem to do. One, they seem to go where the economies are booming faster than native are. And second, they seem to be attracted to this high dense, high productive economy much more than natives are. So this is a study from Kalenikova that shows that when there is an employment shock, which is on the horizontal axis, the population of low-skilled native does not respond very much. Native lose a job and stay where they are in terms of city or local labor market. So there is not very much response of mobility of native to negative economic shock. To the contrary, low-skilled immigrant respond very much. If this slope is almost 1, it's 0.7. If it's 1, it means that you lose the job and you move to another place where you can find a job. So these people are very responsive to this, and in any allocational type of idea that you have, they improve, therefore, the allocation of labor in the United States. But also what is dramatic is that in terms of where they are, there is a massively larger amount of foreign-born in the highly dense, highly productive city than in the low-dense, non-very productive. This is the percentage of foreign-born going from non-urban American to urban, top 10 MSA, not top 10, urban, top 10, and LA and New York are the two cities with the largest share of immigrants. You probably would not know, New York would be 40% smaller without the foreign-born. So the amount of immigrant contribution to this large, dense, and highly productive economy is much larger than immigration going to this lower economy. So in this perspective, clearly, immigrants make the economy work a little bit better. They are more responding to economic incentive. They increase the efficiency of where labor is. They feel some skill and ability, maybe making native better off. But certainly, in the overall response to economy to shock, they help quite a bit. So I just want to say one thing about highly skilled immigration, because I think that one simple thing that we can do is recognize that recent immigration has been very highly skilled, and there is one group that has been growing like crazy. So Chad at some point said that when the H-1B reform was in there, the number of this hurt the number who come for study reason. I would rephrase this as saying that it slowed the growth. This growth would have been even faster without. But the visa, the student visa has been the visa category growing much faster. So after September 11 was a period in which these visa were delayed for a while because of some students were having those visa. But then after that, there's been a tripling of this number. I think that this being a very large channel of inflow opens up a very interesting policy question. These people get their education here, get their human capital here, and many of them have to go back home because they're not given a visa. One interesting thing would be, let's link some of this visa to this, will ease their integration, they will have human capital. This will be a very important contribution. Also, as Chad said, they have increased, they have been scientists and engineers. The whole growth of STEM as a percentage worker of total is being due to the increase in foreign-born in the blue part. So that's an important fact. I'm going to skip the H1B. And so, with this in mind, what should we think, or what policies should we analyze which have been interesting? The H1B has been an interesting policy which has been studied, and I think that people have said that fewer immigrants with H1B has hurt the growth of the American economy. I think that our role of economists is also that of saying, look, there are some catastrophes that say that if you do something, catastrophe will happen. And here I put two of the policies which are often considered as potentially quite damaging. Let me start from the second. One is opening the border. Now, opening the border, which is always associated to the massive inflow of people, they will disrupt everything. So now, some countries have opened the border technically to foreign workers, and one is Switzerland. We have studied with some. Switzerland, between 2002 and 2004, has opened its border to EU workers, just as other EU workers have opened to each other. And what we will do, it has done this first, it has done to everybody, but in 2004, it did it to these which are called cross-border workers that can live in other countries nearby and can work in Switzerland. This allowed us to exploit the variation over time, which is when the reform was passed, and over space. And what we observe is that this reform has actually generated a massive flow of high-skilled in Switzerland, because Switzerland pays relatively high wages to high-skilled. And this has come with the effect that wages for high-skilled Swiss have actually increased. And we were puzzled, and this comes, studying the firms that are here at the border, from the fact that this higher number of skilled from abroad has increased the innovation, the growth, the high-tech progress in those sectors, and has actually attracted more skilled Swiss natives. So in this, you see at work that maybe you think that this flooding of the market will depress wages. It doesn't. It does the opposite. Second, we looked at refugees. It is a moral imperative to them, but do they help or hurt the local community? And even here, most of the government use this dispersal policy of refugees, and we used one in Denmark, which allowed the dispersion of a very large number of Bosnian refugees. And what we find that actually the local economy that absorbs these refugees were growing a little bit faster, but more interesting, the workers who were doing the low-end jobs before the refugee were pushed up in the ladder of wages when refugee came in, who take their manual jobs, as has been said before, and became a little bit more supervisor, and actually the native growth, the native wages seem to benefit. Okay, so the economists seem to keep saying this is good, but citizens seem to be responding quite differently. So, as I have spent a good chunk of my career looking at how immigrants affect the economy, and people have opposed to me saying, well, okay, but if they are so good for the economy, then voters should recognize it and should vote for them, and I'm like, not necessarily. We wanted to look, we have looked at more recently how people respond with their vote. Before I show you the result, let me say that we have a couple of other papers in which that we will build on, in which we show that people's misperception about immigrants is just massive. It's misperception, and it is a misinterpretation of very basic number. If you ask an American, how many immigrants do you think there are in the US, what percentage of the population, the average American will tell you about 30-35%. And the right number is about 12-13%. If you ask an Italian, he will say 40%, and they're 10%. So there is a massive misperception of how many immigrants there are. But this misperception can lead and can bring to actual response. So here we, in two recent papers, we have looked at whether the change of immigration at the local level has changed the vote of American citizens in at the local level. And even here, we sort of started looking at the aggregate effect, but we pretty soon realized that we had to divide, to separate how people respond to the inflow of low-skilled and how people respond to the inflow of high-skilled immigrants. And we did this also across ethnicity. So there is an association between skill and ethnicity, but you can do it within. So for Mexican, for Chinese, for Indian, and the results are very robust. So the idea, and what we seem to find, and this is true here, I'm going to show a map for Europe, which shows that this seems to be in Europe, is that, so here I am calling this, in response to the inflow of low-skilled immigrants, there seems to be a movement of the vote of citizens towards right-wing, relatively nationalist type of party. In the U.S., what we studied is the movement towards Democrat or Republican. Over the period that we studied, which is 94-2012, Republican, we show, has been associated, although not the Republican Party, but on average with the stands which were more anti-immigrant, tougher. And so we consider a move towards Republican as a response to immigration that says people become worried and vote against more immigration, and a movement towards Democrat as a result, as the opposite, in which people respond to the inflow of immigrants by becoming more pro-immigrant. And we analyze this election. We try to use, we try to sort out a little bit other determinants and causality, but here I'm going to show you again a graph that tells us two things. So the correlation, this is the change in low-skilled immigrants in an American county, and this is the change towards the Republican vote share. And here you see that in counties where the share of low-skilled immigrants grew, there is a moderate tendency to vote Republican more. The size of the bubble is the size, the population size of the county. So you see another thing from this graph also, that a lot of the counties that drive the pro-Republican, when they have more immigrants, are smallish, rural counties. In places where there is a relatively small industrial base, which are less urban area, these are the areas where more immigrants push towards the Republican vote. To the contrary, an increase in the share of high-skilled immigrants generates a decline in the share of Republican and a corresponding increase in the share of Democrat. And a lot of this effect is driven by the large cities. Large cities, so you just have to think of California and New York, which are the most among the most democratic counties in the country, and they have had the largest share of immigrants in the country. And this is because they have received quite a bit of high skill on top of several low skill, and these two effects go in the side of the favoring the Democrat side. So interestingly, here it seems that there is this tendency. Then we did this for Europe, choosing 12 countries over 10 years. And here we had to put together parties from all over the map. And so we did this text analysis in which we defined how nationalist is a party by looking at the manifesto of the party and counting how many words they have that refer to nationalism, nationalist value, national value. And then we did a similar analysis to see if across countries in Europe, an inflow of immigrants would have pushed people towards more or less nationalistic type of parties. And again, we find this quite strong regularity that an increase in low-skilled immigrant pushes them towards, but an increase in high-skilled push them away from nationalistic countries. And so here is the idea. The idea is that immigration policies that prescribe more immigrants can actually have the support as long as you argue for a balanced inflow of these two groups. So this is our estimate of the effect of the inflow of immigrants as it was on European regions. The black and the gray means that this region moved towards more nationalist type of position. Just look at the UK, that we know better. A lot of the UK voted anti-Brexit, and it's quite anti-nationalist, except for London, where there were a lot of the high skill and a lot of the local high skill that moved the other way. But with the current inflow, most of Europe veers towards a more nationalist type of country. Now, assume that European country would keep the same amount of low skill and increase the amount of high skill that they admit to the same level. And here is our simulated impact that will happen. Europe will be mostly blue. So in a sense, there is here, the idea is that you can have a immigration policy which is more open and is potentially supported. It doesn't generate their anti-immigration stance if you have a balance, if you more proactively, I would say for Europe this means that more proactively they try to admit and allow high-skilled immigrants rather than only talking about immigration when there is a crisis, and so in the end having this tilted, not decided upon combination of immigrants. So I think that immigrants, more besides not hurting particularly the native, are a very dynamic and very economically responsive part of the labor market in the US that we don't want to lose. And in the future, as changes happen, they will help the US economy to absorb a lot of changes and shock. Of course, we don't want to talk about general effect of immigration, we want to talk effect of specific policy. That's where we learn, and we look at specific policy in other countries historically, and we figure out what they tell us. Finally, again, in this preliminary look at what is the impact on vote, I think there is some evidence that it's not that people are generically against immigration. There is a way of maybe sort of regulating immigration, opening up a little bit more and having a more balanced type of inflow that is also politically viable and economically positive, economically profitable. And I think that's something we should think more about.
Okay, panelists, please come. We'll take questions.
To the extent that there are other factors at play in the United States economy, some of which, for instance, Piketty has documented, and separate and apart from his explanation of what the solutions are, we are seeing a economy with increasing inequality and a highly mobile immigrant sector, as you pointed out, which tends to cluster in the cities. To what extent do you believe that a more balanced immigration policy can address that inequality and its political ramifications, or is the immigration policy being used as a shield for some of the underlying factors?
So I definitely think that immigration has been used as a scapegoat and as a shield for a problem that is real and whose solution, in my eyes, is very complicated and we don't quite know. We know some. We know that taxing a little bit more the very rich would be a good idea, and I think many economists will agree, although maybe not everybody. We know that technology has changed substantially how things have worked, and so the ability of workers to retrain, requalify themselves into jobs which are on the winning rather than on the losing side of technology is probably important. We know that training and school will play a good role about this. I really don't think that immigration policy are going to fix or change that at all. If together with others they can help a little bit on the margin, but I think it's misplacing the solution of a problem which is real.
Interestingly, in comparing past and present, it seems like in the past there was very little discussion of the potential negative effects of immigrants on American workers in justifying the border closure. So the politicians at the time were emphasizing cultural differences, lack of assimilation, differences that they thought were racial in scientific racist terms, therefore immigrant groups that would never be able to join US society because they were racially different. There was very little conversation about economics. Now today it seems like there was conversation about potential effect of immigrants on native workers through the 90s and 2000s, and what's different in the current administration is that there's been a shift in the way that immigrants are talked about, and the concerns that are being raised are again more cultural and racialized, and it's there where we see the traction. We didn't see much traction for restricting immigration when the conversation was focused in economic terms, so I'm not sure there really is a use of immigration as a scapegoat for economic considerations. the policy discussion seems to be more on the cultural and racial side.
And I would posit that that is because there is a significant anger, a rural-urban divide that has an economic substrata that the political class does not want to ground in an economic understanding. But that's just my opinion.
If I can say my little cynical view also, I think these days the economic argument against immigration is something that people can say loud, but cultural or racist, they probably won't. And so if you feel one way, you know, everywhere you can go and say, we don't want immigrants because they hurt us, our economy, but it's a little harder to say that we don't want them because we don't want certain colors or certain races. So.
Ethan, you were talking about the Barcero program. One of my understanding, I think, of that from Doug Massey is that the effect of that policy removal was to turn circular immigrants into permanent residents, whether legal or not. Do you see that in the data as well, and does it complicate?
We don't think that's what happened. I mean, it's not. You can never rule out a negative rate, I guess, logically. But there's not the kind of strands of evidence we can look at suggest there wasn't kind of a secret replacement of the Bracero workers with unauthorized flows from Mexico. No. Not, at least not immediately after the program ended, which is when we were looking.
Any other questions? Yes?
This is not a very interesting question because I'm just coming back to the issue of technological change, which I brought up before, and maybe it would be best for Ethan, but I'd love to know any thoughts of yours. Frequently, when I talk about the specialization benefits of low-skill immigration, the response is, well, look, those jobs are going away, and I find that hard to square with some of the work by David Otter, Daron Ajamolo, others suggesting that technological change is actually having much more complex effects on the labor market. That while it might lead to a hollowing out of middle skill jobs, it could actually increase the demand at the lowest skill end at the same time that it is on high skill end, and actually convert those from technological substitutes, which is how we economists usually model those things, into complements in a way that might change the immigration equation for low skill immigration in a way that runs very much against the common public understanding of how mechanization might change those effects going forward. As you can see, it's not something that I've thought through even close to adequately. I'm just very interested in your thoughts on the subject. Chad earlier alluded to some work of yours, Giovanni, and I think we might all benefit from hearing about that because it's very, very topical.
So let me start with a couple of facts that I've learned on this, which I think are important, and then tell you what I think technological growth means. So if you take most of the graph of the polarization of the labor market over the skill dimension, in which there has been this big increase in employment at low level of skill and big increase at the high, the increase in employment at the low level of skill, 90% of that is foreign-born. If you take away the foreign-born, you get still almost a bias. So that's interesting. That means that the technological progress as it has happened right now, which has reduced the mid-class routine type of job and increased a lot the demand for manual type of job, which are not substituted by technology so far, seems to have been responded to by immigrants. A lot of those are undocumented. So my point is that immigration has responded a lot to technology in the last 30 years, so that we have allowed a lot of people to come in undocumented because our firms and our cities really needed them, and there was a very large demand. And if that demand is not there anymore, maybe we will have fewer of these people coming in. So there will be a response of immigration to technology. But which I think it could definitely happen. The second thing is, will technology then start substitute some of these manual jobs? And so far we have seen a lot of these, personal services, food services, not to decline very much, but it even increased. And so I don't know if technology will continue to take only jobs in the middle or will start at the bottom. One thing I think is true is that the US, so the fact that immigrants have had a very elastic response in supply to this type of job and they have come in, maybe has generated a lot of job and maybe a little bit less wage growth down. And so maybe what will happen if immigrants don't come in is that some of these jobs will become very, very more expensive. Maybe there will be less demand for those. I doubt that Americans, as Leah was hinting, will go down to those type of jobs, because that will imply that from the middle of the range you have to take a job that pays significantly less, that many Americans will do this. So offshoring what you can offshore, mechanize what you can. I don't think that at the low level we will see an inversion, and so American will start taking those type of jobs. So if you close immigration or if you reduce immigration, I think that you're not going to have that spike up there, and all the complementary type of job I think will be lost. But I do think that, to me, that is a sign that immigration has responded significantly to demand.
Okay, I think
I just have a quick thing to add to that, which is another lesson from history, which is there's no law of nature that says technological change is skill biased. It wasn't in the late 19th century, so it could go the other way.
we have two questions, one there and then one here. We'll take them both. And go ahead.
Giovanni, you said that we would need to have redistributive policies in order to ease the pain of the lower income classes and so on. But as Alberto Alesina and colleagues pointed out in, I think, 2015, why doesn't the US have a welfare state? States that have a larger black population have less social spending or something. And that, what could actually happen is that as the proportion of foreign-born increases, then that takes the place of that racial polarization that Alesina and others have pointed out. So that you would try to ease the political backlash, but the policies may not be feasible.
Well, if you let balance the inflow of high and low skill, I don't think, maybe you will have, so this per se shouldn't have such a strong adverse distributional consequences. The big distributional consequence is if you only let in very low skilled, which are a fiscal net transfer and maybe a competition at the low end. If you have a balanced policy, which seems to be supported, you reduce a little bit the need for a strong redistribution. If more immigration will cause the same type of reduction of the size of the public state or the welfare as ethnicity differences have, in the Alesina side, that I'm not 100% sure, but there are, you can think that maybe they will. But I am thinking that a balanced immigration will generate also less distributional issues, so maybe less need of an immediate response.
Last question, sorry.
I think it's again to Giovanni in a way, but I suspect this might be something all of you have thoughts on. So you emphasize the importance of geographic mobility that is especially prevalent among immigrants. And it sounds as if you are taking this to be, if you will, a sort of an unmitigated good. It's a good thing to respond to sort of changes, labor market shocks. But obviously a lot of people think that a certain form of stability in one's life is itself valuable, right? And so one thing I wonder about is to what extent the existence of a very flexible immigration labor force actually makes it easier for potential employers to, say, move away from a place where they used to be. Now, if that were so, and I don't have views on this, but if this were so, this would actually potentially have negative effects on the native-born population that doesn't want to move, right? That has independent grounds, non-economic grounds. There's independent grounds for wanting to stay put. I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that kind of phenomenon are.
One thing to mention there is that the speed of internal migration for the native-born has changed a lot over the century. So since 1990, the pace of mobility across states, across even counties, has declined a lot for the native-born. And we don't yet have a good understanding of why, but to the extent that people do have preferences to stay in their current location, and that's revealed through their mobility choices, then having immigrants willing to move may facilitate the native-born staying put. And that's a potential benefit that we haven't thought much about, but if there's a negative shock to Las Vegas and Phoenix, for example, during the Great Recession, and it's the immigrants who are leaving, either moving to another labor market in the US or returning to the home country, by their departure, that eases some of the local shock and may allow the native-born to stay put if that's something that they value. In the past, the native-born were much more flexible themselves across labor markets. So we saw when in the 20s, when the quota hits, then it's the native-born who are flowing in and out in response. But that's less so true today.
Yes, right. So having this group that absorbs the shock makes the other willing, and this group has revealed that they are more likely to move. So in a sense, you let people who are more willing to move, and you have the people who don't have lower economic consequence if they don't move and they stay. In a paper, we argue that in Europe is even more. The people who came from outside of Europe are massively mobile within Europe, and they have been a little bit of a shock absorbers for the relatively big shock between Germany, Italy. They move around, and so they let the local people stay without having such a big unemployment effect, because when there are no jobs, there are fewer people, and so the local get what is left.
One last question.
Just really quick. Thank you. So is the tendency to mobility as great amongst high-skilled immigrants as it is amongst those who have lower skill? I just wonder if they may be the people who end up wanting to be like the native-born, and we just want to stay
So
put.
the tendency to move is much higher for high-skilled in any group than low-skilled. That's true. So high-skilled natives are much more willing to move than low-skilled native, and high-skilled immigrant than low-skilled immigrant. But the interesting part is that the mobility of low-skilled immigrant is massively larger than the mobility of low-skilled native, and in almost as larger as so. Low-skilled immigrant, their mobility pattern, they look almost like high-skilled natives in terms of how willing they are in response of shocks or in general to move. High-skilled immigrants are even a little bit more, but I think the big news here is that low-skilled immigrants are very willing to move relative to low-skilled natives.
Okay, let's take a 10-minute break and then we'll reconvene for the panel.